At the height of the Cold War, American U-2 spy planes glided serenely at 70,000 feet, so high that Soviet interceptor pilots joked the Dragon Lady was untouchable, mocking its arrogance in public while grappling with silent humiliation behind closed doors. Failed intercepts vanished from official logs. Hero medals became dreams deferred. But when Moscow unleashed its secret armored fist, the S-75 Dvina missile system, the so-called altitude war would tilt overnight. What really happened the morning the myth of invulnerability was exploded by a single flickering radar blip. Soviet pilots in the late 1950s wore their uniforms with the swagger expected of men defending the world's largest nation. In public, they scoffed at the American U-2, calling it a clumsy glider, a target so slow it barely seemed to move across the sky. The press whispered about the so-called Dragon Lady with a mixture of derision and forced bravado, spinning tales of Soviet airmen ready to swat the intruder from the heavens the moment it dared descend. Jokes circulated in officers' lounges. Some said the U-2 was just a weather balloon with delusions of grandeur. Others called it the ghost that haunted their radars, a wisp of arrogance on the edge of the stratosphere. Yet behind the curtain of state media and official pronouncements, the reality was harder to swallow. Every time a U-2 crossed Soviet borders, radar operators watched its blip drift serenely across their screens, untouchable at 70,000 feet. Interceptor regiments scrambled MiG-19 fighters and later the promising Su-9 aircraft, but each attempt ended the same way. Engines gasping in the thin air, pilots forced to level off thousands of meters below their quarry. No medals were awarded, no victories were celebrated. The only souvenirs were the contrails of the U-2 etched high above their own airfields, a daily reminder of impotence. This frustration became a quiet ritual. Commanders filed reports that vanished into classified archives. Squadron logs told of heroic climbs and abrupt abandonments, but these stories never reached the front page. Instead, the myth of Soviet readiness was maintained for the world to see. Pilots, meanwhile, traded sardonic quips in mess halls. "Maybe next time, comrade, we'll bring a ladder." In cartoons clipped from Crocodile, the U-2 might be drawn as a fat American eagle perched smugly atop a lamppost, with Soviet fighters barking helplessly below. The message was clear. The intruder was an insult, not a threat. At least that is what the public was meant to believe. But pride and ridicule are a thin shield against humiliation. As months turned to years and the Dragon Lady continued her high-altitude parade, the gap between official confidence and private despair only widened. The promise of a hero of the Soviet Union medal for the man who brought down the invincible spy plane became a bitter joke. Each failed scramble deepened the sense of wounded honor, a wound kept hidden but never allowed to heal. Inside the closed world of the PVO, the pressure never eased. Pilots who once joked about the U-2 in the mess hall now found themselves haunted by its silent taunt. Officially, the failures did not exist. State secrecy directives forbade even a whisper about altitude gaps or missed intercepts. Squadron logs were locked away, and any mention of the American ghost was scrubbed from public record. But the humiliation lingered in every corridor, in every silent glance between men who had spent their careers preparing to defend Soviet airspace, only to be left watching contrails dissolve far above their reach. Every failed scramble felt like a personal defeat. The hero of the Soviet Union medal, once a symbol of ultimate achievement, became a phantom reward. Pilots imagined what it would mean to be the first to bring down the Dragon Lady, the parade, the promotion, the moment their names would be etched in history. Yet each day ended with the same bitter routine: a report filed, a mission logged, and the knowledge that nothing had changed. The U-2 remained untouchable. In private, determination hardened. The shame of impotence did not breed resignation, it bred obsession. Quiet conversations unfolded behind closed doors, far from the ears of political officers. Pilots and engineers traded rumors of new weapons in development, systems that might finally reach the stratosphere, systems that might finally erase the stain left by the American overflights. Some clung to the hope that the next scramble would be different. Others pinned their faith on the whispers from research institutes in Moscow and Kaliningrad, where scientists worked under strict secrecy to deliver the answer the PVO so desperately needed. The culture of heroism, so carefully cultivated by the state, became a double-edged sword. The promise of glory was now a goad, driving men to push their machines to the very edge of disaster. Yet no matter how many times they risked flameout or blackout, the outcome was always the same. The sky remained divided, one world for those who climbed as high as metal and muscle would allow, another for the intruder who sailed above the war. A sense of resolve began to crystallize. If the old doctrine could not deliver the victory they craved, perhaps something new would. The dream of reclaiming the sky no longer belonged to braggarts or optimists. It became the quiet mission of every pilot and every engineer who refused to accept the humiliation as permanent. In the shadows of secrecy, the race to close the gap had already begun. Inside CIA headquarters, the U-2's altitude was more than a technical achievement, it was a shield. Agency analysts pored over flight logs and radar intercepts, convinced that no Soviet fighter could threaten their Dragon Lady at 70,000 feet. Declassified briefings from the late 1950s show a quiet confidence. MiG-19 struggled above 55,000 feet, and even the newer Su-9s topped out near 60,000 feet. The numbers left a wide, comfortable margin. In closed-door meetings, American planners spoke of the U-2 as operating above the war, untouchable, gathering secrets at leisure, while Soviet defenses flailed helplessly below. For 5 years, the record seemed to prove them right. Over 24 deep penetration flights returned with high-resolution images of airfields and missile sites, each mission reinforcing the myth of invincibility. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, Soviet air defense planners read the same altitude figures with growing alarm. The PVO's best interceptors, pride of the arsenal, could not reach the cruising heights of the intruder. Internal memos and classified reports told a stark story. Every scramble ended with pilots forced to level off, engines straining against the limits of physics, the U-2's contrail receding into the blue. The humiliation was not just personal, but strategic. Each successful overflight exposed a gap in the nation's armored fist, a vulnerability that could not be fixed with more sorties or louder boasts. This was not a problem that could be solved with rhetoric or discipline. Soviet planners understood that the altitude war was being lost not for lack of will, but for lack of reach. The urgency bled into every classified discussion, every funding request. The question was no longer whether the Americans would return, but how long the PVO could endure the daily proof of its own impotence. In response, a new line of thinking began to take shape, one that would demand secrecy, resources, and a willingness to rewrite the rules of air defense. The search for an answer moved from the cockpit to the laboratory, from the familiar world of jet engines to the uncharted territory of guided missiles. Inside the laboratories of OKB Lavochkin, the frustration of the altitude war took on a new form. Here, engineers and officers gathered behind locked doors, hunched over blueprints and radio schematics, searching for a way to drag the unreachable American intruder back within range of Soviet steel. The S-75 Dvina was not born from a single order, but from a cascade of classified memos and urgent midnight calls, each stamped with the weight of humiliation suffered at 70,000 feet. Development began in 1953, but the project gained ferocious momentum after each failed scramble. The challenge was clear: build a weapon that could climb higher, strike faster, and think quicker than any jet. Early tests in 1955 and 1956 ended in disappointment. Missiles detonated too low, guidance faltered in the thin stratosphere, and engineers faced a wall of technical limits as daunting as any border. Yet the work did not stop. Every unsuccessful trial meant another round of redesigns, another shipment of parts rushed from Moscow, another night spent chasing rumors of the next U-2 incursion. Secrecy was absolute. Even among trusted PVO officers, details of the true purpose of the S-75 were whispered, never written. Deployment orders arrived in code, routed through special channels. By 1957, the first operational batteries were quietly installed around Moscow and other strategic sites, hidden beneath camouflage nets and guarded by men who understood the stakes. The system relied on the fan-song radar, an ungainly loop of antennas that could track a target across 25 kilometers of sky, locking onto the faintest echo of a glider at the edge of space. Missiles were fed commands by radio, their trajectories adjusted in real time by ground crews watching flickering oscilloscope screens, hands poised over the launch key. By 1960, the S-75 had become the backbone of a new defense doctrine. Around Sverdlovsk, batteries stood ready, crews drilled to exhaustion, radars humming through the spring nights, all waiting for the moment when the untouchable would finally cross into the kill zone. The gap between humiliation and hope narrowed with each test, each deployment. The weapon was now in place, silent and unseen, poised to answer the insult that had haunted Soviet skies for years. At 0800 hours, the radar screens inside the Sverdlovsk PVO command post flickered with a single, unwavering blip. 70,000 feet above the Urals, the Dragon Lady had returned, alone, silent, and seemingly untouchable. For the men on duty, this was the moment years of humiliation had prepared them for. The order was clear and absolute. Assemble a wall of steel. Phones rang in quick succession, relaying the directive to interceptor squadrons and missile battalions. There was no time for debate. Controllers barked coordinates, their voices clipped and urgent as MiG-19s and Su-9s roared from their revetments, engines straining against the thinning air. In the crowded operations room, every eye was fixed on the glowing trace. The U-2's course was predictable, but its altitude mocked every previous attempt at interception. Reports from the radar net confirmed what everyone already knew. Fighters would be climbing into air they could barely breathe, chasing a target that seemed to exist in another world. Yet the scramble began anyway, each pilot hoping that this time fate would bend in their favor. Down the hall, missile crews stood by at their consoles, hands poised above the launch keys. The fan-song radar locked onto the intruder, feeding data to the S-75 batteries ringed around the city. The command post fell into a hush, broken only by the click of toggles and the low hum of machinery. Above them all, the blip continued its steady march, indifferent to the chaos it left in its wake. The doctrine gap had been replaced by a new kind of readiness, one measured not in altitude but in seconds and nerves. The wall of steel was in motion. The order to fire came in a clipped voice, no hesitation, no flourish. In the missile vans outside Sverdlovsk, crews keyed in the final coordinates. The fan-song radar tracked the U-2's ghostly trace, feeding guidance pulses to a battery of S-75 Dvina missiles. At 8:53, the first missile leapt skyward, climbing through the thinning air in a supersonic arc. It missed, detonating behind the American aircraft, but the shockwave rolled forward, a wall of invisible force. Francis Gary Powers felt it as a sudden, violent shudder. One moment, the cockpit was silent except for the faint whine of the engine. The next, the world exploded in orange light. The blast did not have to strike directly. At 70,000 feet, the U-2's long, delicate wings were built for endurance, not for battle. The pressure wave sheared the right wing from the fuselage, sending the aircraft into a tailspin. Instruments spun, panels tore free, and and in seconds, the Dragon Lady was no longer an airplane, but a scattering of debris tumbling through the stratosphere. On the ground, interceptors scrambled into the missile corridor, blind to the danger above. Soviet pilots, desperate for a kill, nearly flew into the same kill zone, their radio chatter laced with confusion and panic. Reports later hinted at near misses and frantic evasive maneuvers, but the real damage was already done. Powers, dazed and half-conscious, fought to escape the spinning wreck. He bailed out into the freezing void, drifting down into a world that had just changed forever. By the time he reached the ground, the myth of American invincibility had been shattered and the altitude war had a new victor. In Washington, the first cables from Moscow landed with a thud. Within hours of the Sverdlovsk disaster, the National Security Council convened behind closed doors. The myth of the untouchable Dragon Lady had collapsed in a single flash. Now every assumption about the altitude war was under the microscope. On May 5, 1960, a formal suspension order grounded all deep penetration U-2 flights over the Soviet Union. The CIA's confidence, built on years of unchallenged overflights, gave way to a scramble for answers. Planners dissected radar logs and after-action reports, searching for any sign that the Soviets had telegraphed the leap in missile capability. Panic simmered beneath the surface. The enemy had closed the gap, and nobody knew how far the new threat reached. Inside the Pentagon and CIA headquarters, the conversation shifted overnight. Memos urging immediate investment in electronic countermeasures and the acceleration of the A-12 Oxcart and SR-71 Blackbird programs began circulating. Budgets were redrawn with urgency, and Lockheed's Skunk Works received new directives to push the limits of speed and altitude. The National Reconnaissance Office sent cables outlining a pivot to satellite reconnaissance, no longer trusting the sky would remain American territory for long. The operational pause was more than a tactical retreat. It was the end of an era. For the first time, the United States had to admit its most advanced spy plane was not only vulnerable but mortal. The shock in Washington was immediate, the response frantic, and the old doctrine of invincibility dissolved in a matter of days. In Moscow, the Kremlin seized on the downing of the U-2 as proof that the Soviet Union could not only defend its skies, but humiliate its rivals on the world stage. Within days, TASS bulletins and Pravda headlines thundered with news of the American spy brought down by Soviet missiles. The battered wreckage of the Dragon Lady, its wings twisted and its cameras exposed, became the centerpiece of a public spectacle. Photographs of Francis Gary Powers, alive and in custody, were splashed across front pages. The message was unmistakable. The era of untouchable American overflights was finished. Khrushchev wasted no time turning the incident into a political weapon. As delegates gathered in Paris for the long-awaited summit in mid-May 1960, he brandished the evidence: a parade of wreckage, a captured pilot, a confession wrung from an American officer. Eisenhower's attempts at damage control collapsed under the weight of Soviet theatrics. On May 16, 1960, Khrushchev stormed out of the summit, declaring negotiations impossible in the face of American aggression. The empty seats in Paris echoed across the globe, signaling a dramatic rupture in East-West relations. The Soviet leadership basked in the moment. For years, the PVO had endured ridicule and skepticism. Now, the world watched as the myth of Western invincibility crumbled. The propaganda value was immense. The Kremlin had turned a battlefield triumph into diplomatic capital, recasting humiliation as vindication and using the shattered Dragon Lady to redraw the lines of the Cold War. Today, altitude is no longer an absolute sanctuary. Satellites peer down, hypersonic missiles rise, and airspace is contested by algorithms as much as pilots. The altitude war proved that every technological edge is temporary, and every myth of invincibility is destined to crack. As new arsenals emerge, so do new blind spots. The next wall of steel is already being built, out of secrets, speed, and the same old certainty. What will shatter it next?